After a violent storm off the coast of Scotland in 1887, a ship was wrecked and 7 men were left clinging to the masts for their lives. After 6 days, only 2 remained, but they had no idea where they were. How did these 2 survivors get found after 6 days at sea? What was the mysterious force that guided the rescuers to the exact spot? And why has it baffled historians ever since? This is the incredible tale of one of the greatest maritime mysteries of all time. It all started with a ship named the John William Gordon. It was a small cargo ship carrying a load of coal from Newcastle to Leith in Edinburgh. The journey was expected to take about 12 hours. But around 6 a.m. on January 1887, the ship's captain, Thomas Henderson, reported to his wife that the ship had encountered rough waters and high waves. He believed he might have to divert to the Isle of Man because of the weather, but he would keep trying to make it to Scotland. Then there was silence. On January, a tremendous storm hit the northeast coast of Scotland, causing massive waves that crashed over the shore, inundating entire streets. People were forced to flee their homes, sheltering in place until the storm passed. At the height of the storm, an 18-year-old girl was blown off the pier by a wave and swept out to sea. People ran along the pier desperately trying to grab hold of her, but she was gone. The water was too rough for any rescue boat to venture out. She simply vanished. When the sun finally came up, the people on the shore realized that the girl was not the only thing that was missing. 3 ships had also been lost in the storm, including the John William Gordon. It was feared that all 3 ships had gone down off the coast of Arbroath, and that everyone on board was dead. The town was plunged into mourning. For a few days, the coast was scoured by volunteers and lifeboat crews. But the wind and waves had churned the sea so much that even the wreckage could not be found. Then, just when hope was beginning to fade, something appeared on the horizon. It was a piece of wreckage from the lost ships, which inspired renewed hope that the crews had survived. But this was quickly dashed when it was discovered that the wreckage contained the body of one of the men from the lost ship. They were not alive. However, the search was not abandoned. Every day people went out onto the coast in the hopes of finding something else. And then after 6 long days, something happened that could not be explained. 2 men were spotted waving for help on a sandbank 20 miles off the coast. They were cold, starving, and dehydrated, but they were alive. Somehow they had managed to survive for 6 days at sea when all hope had been lost. But how did the rescuers find them after all this time? How did they know exactly where to look? The answer lies in the details of the story, details that many people missed. You see, the 2 men who were rescued were not actually from one of the lost ships. In fact, they had nothing to do with the John Williams. They were 2 of the 4 crew members from another ship called the Agnes, which had become trapped in the same storm as the John Williams. It was a small fishing boat which became stranded on a sandbank during the height of the storm. Somehow its captain and 2 crew members survived for 6 days. But what about the other crew member? Unfortunately, he did not survive. His name was James Thompson, son of the captain, and his actions before the ship wrecked may have saved the lives of the other men. You see, when the Agnes was first caught in the storm, the men knew they would not be able to keep the ship anchored in such rough seas. So they did something desperate. They dropped anchor and tied ropes from the mast to the keel of the boat. This meant that if the ship did break apart, the anchor would keep the wreckage together and allow the men to hang on to the mast while they waited for rescue. It worked until it didn't. As the ship slowly began to crack, the men clung to the mast for their lives. But eventually the ship split in half, and the men were thrown into the raging sea. Young Thompson saw that the other 2 men had been swept away by the current. Knowing he had to act fast, he grabbed a piece of wreckage and began swimming towards them. As he struggled against the current, he kept shouting instructions on how they should orient themselves to conserve their strength and wait for rescue. Eventually, he managed to reach the other 2 men and tie them all together with a rope. But unfortunately, he was too weak to go on and died in front of their eyes. Even though they were exhausted, the other 2 crew members refused to give up. They began untying themselves from the wreckage to try and free themselves from the weight. But once they were free, they soon realized that they were stuck on a sandbank and the wind had completely died down, meaning that no ships could hear their cries for help. All they had was each other and the faint hope that someone would come looking for them. And it was that hope that kept them going. You see, when the people from the mainland realized that the storm had taken 3 ships, they feared that there would be no survivors. However, they knew that the fishing boats usually carried life buoys, which were like buoys that could be thrown into the water to help pull survivors from the wreckage. These life buoys were useful for bringing survivors closer to the shore. But without a lifeboat to pull them in, they were useless. And so the people of the town decided that they would take it upon themselves to search for the crew. Every day, groups of men would set out into the churning sea to scour the coastline in the hopes of finding something. But there was one thing they did not know. The men from the Agnes had been trained in naval rescue operations and knew all about life buoy usage. Once they were free of the wreckage, they had used their life buoy to tow themselves further from the sandbank to an area that was less likely to be searched. They figured that if anyone was coming to look for them, they would head straight to the wreck site, but nobody was coming. By the 6th day, both the captain and the other crew member were absolutely exhausted. They had very little strength left, and they were beginning to lose hope. That was when the captain remembered something. Back in 1877, he had been part of a court investigation after a different shipwreck. And as part of that investigation, he had to testify in front of a judge. And the judge made an unusual request. He asked the captain to demonstrate how sailors would signal for help in such a situation. And the captain obliged, demonstrating a complex system of shouts and whistles that would indicate their location and the number of survivors. The captain turned to his companion and asked him to start the countdown. They would begin by shouting, "Goddamn law," then wait a few seconds and shout, "Where are you, sir?" This was done to ensure that the rescuers knew that the people they were shouting back to were the ones in the water. The other man joined in and shouted, "Goddamn law," then waited for the response. "Where are you, sir?" The sound echoed across the waves, carrying their message of despair and hope. And then they shouted, "Here we are." It took a while, but eventually they heard voices calling back. Someone had seen them. Someone was coming to save them. A boat began approaching, and soon the 2 survivors were pulled out of the freezing water and wrapped in warm blankets. When the news spread around the town that 2 more survivors had been found, the people rejoiced. But it wasn't long before they began asking questions. You see, the people who had come to rescue the men had no idea where to look. They hadn't followed any sort of map or coordinates. They had simply wandered out into the sea and begun searching. And yet somehow they had stumbled upon the exact spot where the 2 men were being held. How could this have happened? Did someone guide them to the survivors? Was it fate that led them there? Or was it something more mysterious? Well, here's the thing. According to reports, the captain had only shouted for help twice before being spotted. In both times, he had forgotten the line that came after, "Here we are." He was supposed to say 3 men on the mast, but instead he had shouted 2 men on the mast. But even with the wrong information, the rescuers had still managed to find them. So what does this mean? Is there some other force at play here? Well, maybe. You see, the captain later explained that he had been in such a state of exhaustion that he had forgotten the line. But he had tried his best to make it up to the rescuers. And perhaps it was that effort, that silent plea for help, that guided the rescuers to the right spot. Perhaps in their desperation, the 2 men had inadvertently given the rescuers a clue that they needed. Of course, this is just a theory. And in the end, we may never really know what happened. But one thing is certain. Without the quick thinking of young James Thompson, none of the crew would have survived. His actions saved the lives of the other men, even if it meant sacrificing his own. Now, this case has been debated by historians for years. Many have tried to explain it away as just a lucky guess, but others believe that something more mysterious was at play. So I'll ask you, do you think the rescuers were guided to the survivors by some sort of higher power, or was it just a lucky guess? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.